Hello, welcome. It's just gone midday here in Moscow. You're watching RT International. We'll start with breaking news too, because at least 16 people are reported to have been killed when Islamic State fighters launched multiple attacks in the northern Iraqi city of Kirkuk. With more details now, here's our Middle East correspondent, Paula Sleer.
There has been a number of dawn surprise attacks that were carried out by gunmen wearing suicide vests targeting government sites across the Kurdish-controlled Iraqi city of Kirkuk. Now, we understand that among the sites that have been targeted are the police headquarters, police convoys in the city, as well as checkpoints. This is a Kurdish-controlled city that is ethnically divided and for a long time has been a source of contention. At this stage, we're receiving reports that all of the gunmen have been killed, aside from two who remain holed up in a hotel and in a mosque. There was a separate incident 40 kilometers northwest of the city where 3 gunmen infiltrated a power plant that is being built by the Iranians, and some 16 people were killed in that incident alone. Islamic State has claimed responsibility for all of these attacks, which come as an Iraqi government-led offensive that is being assisted by the United States gains momentum against the city of Mosul, which is further north in Iraq. This is the bastion of control of Islamic State in Iraq, and it is a decisive battle that is expected to come at a high price. The offensive began on Monday, the same day on which there were several explosions that rocked the capital city of Baghdad, and dozens of people were killed. The Iraqi Prime Minister has warned that as the Mosul offensive gains momentum, it could lead to a number of deadly reprisal terror attacks in response.
Well, for more now on the situation in Iraq and also Syria too, we're joined by Dirk Adriaensens. He's a member of the peace activist group, the Brussels Tribunal. He's also an Iraq researcher. Good morning to you, Dirk. Thanks for coming on to RT. We've seen ISIL launch an attack on another city just south of Mosul today. Should this be seen as some sort of counter-offensive by the terror group?
Yes, but is that the most pregnant problem now for the moment? I don't know. Everybody seems to have battle plans, but nobody has a peace plan. Of course, ISIS will do counterattacks wherever they want to do that. But what will happen? What will happen in Mosul when there are 7, 8 different groups fighting now alongside each other? But when ISIS will be driven out of Mosul, what will happen next? This is the big question. And will anything change? You know, the Americans have ruined Iraq, really ruined Iraq with their neoliberal policies. The corruption is thriving. The Commission of Integrity of Iraq has said that $500 billion have been stolen during the governance of Maliki. And also notice that, you know, according to a Mercy Corps poll, that different polls that were held between 2013 and 2015, only the announcement that Maliki was replaced by Prime Minister Abadi diminished the support for ISIS among the Sunni population considerably. So if there are no jobs available, so that will there are 37.5 million Iraqis now, and 40% has no job.
Okay.
So what is going to happen? You know, the
sure,
violence
it is Dirk, I
internally.
understand it's a dire situation across the country, but in particular with regards to Mosul, what are your concerns there? Because, you know, we know that particularly for civilians, there are over 500,000 children living there apparently, and we know that ISIL uses them as human shields and many civilians as human shields.
The question is, do they want to drive out ISIS? Do they want to defeat them? I don't think so. they so-called encircled the city of Mosul, but they left the western part open so that the ISIS can regroup in Syria. There's also a think tank in Israel based that does contract work for NATO that has said we shouldn't destroy ISIS. We should weaken them, but definitely not destroy them. So, and Hillary Clinton has said also that the #1 enemy for her is Assad and not ISIS. So,
and Dirk, do you think
these things?
Sure. Do you think that explains perhaps do you think that explains the difference in the West's stance on Aleppo and then also Mosul? Because in Aleppo, we're told by the US State Department that civilians shouldn't be forced to leave there and that Syria and Russia should stop targeting al-Nusra. That seems to be the opposite when they're talking about Mosul.
Well, Syria is a different question from Iraq. There are certain things I don't understand. Why is it that all the countries delivering weapons and arms to the Iraqi governments, NATO, but also the Russian governments, Bulgaria, Canada, Belgium, France, Germany, you name them, they're all selling weapons to so-called to defeat Daesh. But how is it for the people that 20% of the GDP is spent on armament, which means if you look at the figures now, would be about $35 billion spent on destruction and armament instead of starting serious negotiations. There is a very strong civil society in Iraq. The demonstrations against corruption and for a secular state and against partition and against sectarianism are taking place weekly. We never hear about them. But in many cities in the south, in the north, in Baghdad, they are continuously demonstrating. And it's not only these Muqtada al-Sadr people. It's the civil society, including the Communist Party, the Arab nationalist parties, you name it, they're all there.
Look, Dirk, on that point, we're going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. I'm sorry to interrupt. We do have to leave it there, but it's been great to get you onto RT. That was Dirk Adriaensens, a member of the Brussels Tribunal Peace Activist Group. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And of course, we'll be keeping you updated on developments on the Islamic State attack on the city of Kirkuk throughout the day. Now, the ceasefire in the Syrian city of Aleppo has been extended for 24 hours to allow residents to get to safety, although so far militants have been preventing civilians from leaving. The humanitarian pause came into force on Thursday morning and will now end on Friday evening. So far, though, it's brought little peace for the embattled city as rebel fighting in eastern Aleppo continued throughout the day. Well, we're looking at live pictures now from Aleppo. The video is from Russia's Defence Ministry, which is monitoring the ceasefire in real time via web cameras and also surveillance drones. And a live stream is available through a link on our website at rt.com. Our crew that's based in Aleppo at the moment did get caught up in an attack from the rebel-held area on Tuesday. Murad Gazdiev was part of that crew. He spoke to us earlier today from Aleppo.
Today's been calm so far. The two crossings have opened. There are now ambulances, buses, medics waiting at those crossings to be allowed into eastern Aleppo. But, you know, the day could turn bad very quickly, as yesterday showed. Yesterday was a catastrophe. Nobody was allowed in or out of eastern Aleppo, and all the crossings, both of them, were shelled relentlessly from the early hours of the morning till the very late into the night. And yesterday I saw at the crossing many relatives, many people waiting for their loved ones to leave. In fact, you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone in Aleppo that doesn't have a relative or somebody that they know trapped in the east.
أنا أمي هي جوا ومقطوعة، أخوي بده يشيلها وما في مين يساعده يشيلها. إنه عم بقول لي إنه طلع إنه بركي إنه في حدا يساعدني بشيلها، ما عبر الشو، بقول له قدم جوا هذا الإرهاب، يعني الإرهاب إنه عم بقولوا لهم إنه هذا قدمه، طيب هلا أمي أنا مريضة شلون بده يقدم؟ لك متمنية بس انه تطلع، زعلانة عليها الجوع، قتلهم الجوع كافر يا اخي، ما في الذلية، لا بياكلوا لا بيشربوا ابدا.
Aleppo right now is effectively on lockdown by Islamists, by fighters inside. Why they want to keep all these people in there is anyone's guess, but the hope now is that by offering this truce unilaterally, the Russian and Syrian militaries can entice the rebels into letting at least some people go.
That was Murad Gazdiev reporting from Aleppo there. We're following a phone conversation between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his American counterpart. Moscow has said that this ceasefire is in jeopardy because Washington has still failed to fulfil its promise to separate moderate opposition forces from the terrorists. The groups are now fighting each other in eastern Aleppo. The biggest terror group there is Al-Nusra Front. It has changed its name but still remains an offshoot of Al-Qaeda in Syria. It's officially designated too as a terror organisation by the UN, but as RT's Gianni found out, it still falls short of becoming a priority target of the US military.
The State Department has made it clear that fighting al-Nusra is not a priority for the U.S., even though al-Nusra is al-Qaeda in Syria.
Our efforts militarily in Syria, as I said to Dave, is against ISIS, against Daesh. Now, there has been, I think at least one, maybe more, I don't know, you'd have to check with my Pentagon colleagues, but we know al-Nusra, they're outside the cessation of hostilities, they're also a UN-designated terrorist group.
I asked Mr. Kirby if the U.S. had a strategy of its own to fight al-Nusra in Syria, and his response suggested that it's Russia's fault that the U.S. is not going after al-Nusra now.
We did have a strategy, if you might remember, if you go back to September 9th in Geneva, when Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary Kerry talked, and we struck a deal, right, an arrangement where if we got 7 days of reduced violence, we would stand up what was called a joint implementation center, by which we would share information with the Russian military, designed specifically to cooperate against al-Nusra, specifically al-Nusra. I mean, and Daesh. Daesh was mentioned in there, but al-Nusra was specifically named as a target of those kinds of activities that we would be willing to cooperate and share information with the Russians on. We didn't get there. So there was a strategy, and it was implemented, it was written down on September 9th, and you can go back and look at the agreement and see that. We just couldn't get there because the Russians weren't willing to meet their commitments.
Previously, even after the deal with Russia fell apart, U.S. officials said that the U.S. was still fighting al-Nusra in Syria.
We remain unalterably opposed to Daesh and al-Nusra. Al-Nusra is al-Qaeda, and they remain an enemy because they are plotting against the United States and against Europe and others.
Nusra is al-Qaeda in Syria. They are a terrorist organization. You know, we continue to have conversations with those moderate opposition groups on the ground about the importance of demoralizing, of pulling apart.
And other than conversations, is there...
You know, it's a terrorist organization, and we will continue to fight it.
U.S. officials would never really elaborate exactly how they are fighting al-Nusra in Syria. We earlier reached out to the Combined Joint Task Force, which speaks for the U.S.-led coalition's operations in Syria, asking them for a comment on Aleppo, and received a response which said their mission in Syria is to fight ISIL, and because ISIL is not operating in Aleppo, they would not comment. The State Department's response today was in line with what the military said, which is that fighting al-Nusra in Syria is not their priority.
Ganchikan reporting there. So then, to be clear, the US State Department says it does consider al-Nusra to be a terror group, but targeting it is still not a priority in Syria, and that's only because of Russia. We discussed this with Brian Becker from the Anti-War Coalition.
There is an amazing admission by John Kirby, Admiral Kirby, the spokesperson for the State Department, that the United States has reneged on the agreement with Russia to fight against Daesh, ISIL, or so-called Islamic State, and al-Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda, whatever it wants to change its name to. It's al-Qaeda. And so here we have this tremendous irony of ironies that the United States has been at war against terror since 2001. It's devoted the prime parts of its foreign policy to just that. It used it as the pretext for invading Afghanistan, also for carrying out the invasion and occupation of Iraq, also for supporting Saudi Arabia and Yemen, even though the Saudis are the financiers and supporters of ISIS. And the U.S. is launching the war along with the Iraqi government in Mosul. But in Syria, the U.S. government, the Obama administration now admits that they won't fight against and are not fighting against al-Qaeda, which means that they are helping al-Qaeda. And it means that their main priority is not fighting Daesh. Their main priority is, as it always has been, the destruction of the secular, independent, nationalist government of Bashar al-Assad. That's the real deal.
You with RT. We're going to take a quick break now. We'll be back with more news in 2 minutes.
People with stories to tell. Those who deserve to be heard. Studied inside out, but still with unrevealed secrets. Leaders, politicians, thinkers, and witnesses. They're here to speak. Are you there to hear?
Hello again. Now, the Russian president is winning in propaganda and on the ground. That's what the front page of the UK Spectator magazine says. A sinister-looking President Putin is on the front cover of the latest edition, along with RT there in the spotlight. Well, the magazine published 2 articles. One speculates if Moscow is trying to trick the world into thinking it's planning an invasion of the Baltic states, and the other does urge the West to stop sabre-rattling against Russia and suggests too that President Putin is on top in the propaganda war. Well, Kevin Owen did speak to the deputy editor of The Spectator, who told us that the Western hysteria towards Russia can be explained by a need for an enemy, and President Putin fits the bill.
I think The Spectator's in the rare and lucky position of not being Russophobic, but also not really being Russophilic. So I think we've got 2 articles in this issue that look at the matter of Putin, the matter of the Baltic states, and also Syria, and generally the Western hysteria towards Russia.
Brings in the figures, doesn't it? Is that why you've done it? Putin's popular to have on the front cover. That's why you've done it, yeah?
It's obviously a good-selling subject for us, but that doesn't mean we're covering it in a biased way. There's a sort of hysteria about Russia, which I think is some deep psychic need for an enemy, which Putin is filling very neatly for us at the moment. He's winning the information war because it seems his propaganda is rather superior to ours, and we seem to be losing out on many fronts.
Have you got any thoughts about the apparent double standards we're talking about at the moment, certainly this week particularly, about what's happening in Aleppo and what Russia's trying to do there to counter the terrorism, and what's happening in Mosul?
Well, I think there's double standards in Yemen too. I mean, we don't really speak up. Our government certainly doesn't speak up as much about what's happening in Yemen, because that's Saudi Arabia, which of course is an ally of ours. There are huge double standards in Western media. There's huge double standards in Eastern media, I'm sure, and even on such an honest channel as Russia Today. But I think the problem is that we aren't as aware of our double standards, and perhaps that's something we need to improve.
And The Spectator isn't the only magazine focusing on Russia at the moment. The print edition of The Economist is about to hit the shelves with a special report on Russia with the headline Putinism on its front cover. We heard from the chairman of Britain's oldest conservative think tank, the Bow Group, and also from a professor of sociology at Aston University in the UK, and they both believe that playing the Putin card is a way of avoiding more pressing issues.
The idea of World War III does sell newspapers and magazines and is often the topic of Hollywood films, but something has changed, I think, over the last year or two, in which I would describe a sleepwalk towards war, or certainly conflict with Russia, which I think can be a very dangerous side effect of this sort of coverage. That we've gone from a point, perhaps you could say in the Bush era presidency, where Putin was largely an ally of the West in the battle against Islamic terrorism, and we've now found ourselves at a point where we are distracted from battling ISIS in our increasing aggression towards Putin.
There is a sense, and it's a growing sense, that Russia can be blamed for practically any evil in the world at the moment. There has been this cultural shift practically since Ukraine, I think, and then we had the Olympics, and of course now we have Aleppo, and Putin does satisfy this, as it was put a few minutes ago, deep psychic need for a bad guy.
Well, Russia seems to have been a major issue in the US presidential race as well, with accusations flying over hacking, although without any proof being offered.